The thing about Myra Vasquez that nobody tells you up front is that she was, by every measurable standard, the most qualified human in that building. Not the most important, not the most celebrated, but the most qualified. She held 3 degrees, xenolinguistics, cognitive semiotics, and something called multi-species phonological mapping, that even the university that granted it couldn't fully explain to parents at graduation. She'd spent 4 years on Veth Station learning to parse the breath clicks of the Thurani collective before most people her age had even seen a Thurani on a news feed. She could translate in real time across 11 confirmed galactic languages and had partial working fluency in 6 more that were still being cataloged. She was 29 years old. She wore her hair in a braid that always came loose around her left ear by mid-morning. She carried a thermos of black coffee everywhere she went, even into chambers where food and drink were technically prohibited, because nobody ever said anything to her about it, and she figured they never would. She was the kind of person who knew exactly how good she was, and had made peace with the fact that very few other people would ever acknowledge it. That was the deal, that was the job. She was a translator. The Galactic Senate Annex on New Geneva was not the prettiest building humanity had ever constructed, but it was trying its best. It had been built in 2187, in that optimistic flush after the Accord was signed, when everyone on Earth and its 7 colony worlds genuinely believed that joining the galactic community was going to feel like being welcomed into a warm room. The architects had gone all in on that feeling. Curved glass panels that caught the morning light. Gardens on every terrace level. Floors of pale terracite stone that had been chosen specifically because it appeared in buildings on 3 other member worlds. A gesture of shared aesthetic, an architectural handshake. The building was, in the words of the Thurani ambassador who had visited during the opening ceremony, aggressively hospitable. He had not meant it as a compliment. By 2241, the building had aged in the way that aggressively optimistic things tend to age. The glass panels still caught the light, but 3 of them had been replaced with reinforced composites after a minor detonation incident in 2228 that nobody officially talked about. The gardens were maintained by a rotating crew of 12, most of whom spent more time managing the requests of visiting species who found human plant life either offensive, edible, or inexplicably sacred. The terracite floors were still beautiful, but they were now scuffed with the particular marks left by Kreth mobility frames, which moved on 6 articulated legs and tended to gouge soft stone. The building was still trying. It had just learned, over 54 years, exactly what it was dealing with. Myra had been working here for 3 years. She walked in through the east entrance at 7:43 in the morning, 17 minutes before her shift technically began, because the transit pod from her housing block ran early on Tuesdays, and she had long since given up fighting the schedule. She badged through 2 security checkpoints, one human, one automated, nodded to Petra at the translation office front desk, dropped her bag at her station, poured fresh coffee into her thermos from the communal pot that Devlin always made too strong, and pulled up her assignment queue for the day. She had 3 sessions. The first was a routine trade negotiation between the Colonial Agricultural Ministry and a Veth merchant consortium. Standard economic vocabulary, probably 2 hours, low stress. The second was a cultural liaison meeting she'd done 4 times before with slightly different participants each time. She could practically do it from memory. The third was flagged with a notation she didn't recognize at first. Priority override, delegated reassignment. Report to Senate Hall 7/1400. Interpreting for Consul General Vrix Ethan, Sovereignty of Kethvar. Duration, open-ended. Clearance level, modified Tier 4. She stared at that for a long moment. Vrix Ethan. She knew the name. Everyone in the building knew the name, in the way that everyone in a city knows the name of a particular weather system that keeps appearing on the forecast. Consul General Vrix Ethan of Kethvar had been serving at the Senate Annex for 14 months. In those 14 months, she had filed 6 formal complaints against the translation office, had rejected or dismissed 4 assigned interpreters, had twice requested what she called cognitively adequate support staff in language that the complaint handlers had recorded carefully, and then spent 2 weeks arguing about whether to flag officially. Her species, the Kethvari, were And this was the language the xenosociological briefings used, language chosen specifically to be neutral, functionally hierarchical in their self-conception. Which was the diplomatic way of saying, they believed, as a biological and cultural fact wired into their neurochemistry, that they sat at the top of every room they entered. Not arrogantly, not cruelly necessarily, but structurally. The way a human might believe, without thinking about it, that they are the subject of their own life rather than a background character in someone else's. The Kethvari simply could not conceive of a room in which they were not the most significant entity present. This made Senate work challenging. Myra finished her coffee and started rereading the file. Hall 7 was one of the smaller deliberation chambers in the annex, not the grand central forum with its tiered galleries and its famous holographic translator arrays, but a working room. Long table of pale composite. Chairs that had been modified for 12 different body configurations. Overhead panels tuned to the spectral preferences of the current session's participants. Water dispensers that offered 6 different atmospheric pressures and temperatures, because some species processed hydration through their skin. Myra arrived at 1347. The room already had 2 people in it. One was Davin Cho, a senior diplomatic aide she'd worked with twice before, methodical, quiet, good at reading a room, the kind of person who seemed to exist specifically to make difficult situations slightly less difficult. He was arranging a series of data pads at one end of the table with the careful attention of someone who had been briefed extensively on exactly what this meeting could turn into. The other was Vrix Ethan. Myra had seen images. The briefing files all had them, low-resolution stills from previous sessions, the kind of photos taken at distance by protocol staff who understood instinctively not to get too close. The images had not fully prepared her. Consul General Vrix Ethan stood. The Kethvari did not sit in the conventional sense. They rested in a semi-reclined posture that required a specialized support frame at the far end of the room. She was tall, or at least her upper body was. A long, pale thorax that tapered at the waist before widening into a lower body carried on 4 articulated limb segments, each ending in a flat pressure pad rather than a foot. Her skin, if you called it skin, was the particular shade of blue-gray that the briefings described as neutral display color, meaning she wasn't showing any strong emotional chromatic response at the moment. Her face was broadly humanoid in arrangement, but with the addition of 2 lateral sensory organs just above the cheekbones that the Kethvari used for close-range atmospheric reading. Her eyes were large and gold and didn't blink at the same interval as human eyes. She was wearing something that Myra recognized from a terminology briefing as a status drape, layers of fine composite fabric in deep blue and silver that indicated rank in a way that was meant to be immediately legible to anyone who could read Kethvari visual language. Myra could read it, she had studied. The status drape said, roughly translated, "I am the highest-ranking person in any room I enter, and you are correct to notice this." She looked at Myra the way someone looks at an object they've ordered, but aren't certain was the right model. "You are the new voice rendering unit," Vrix Ethan said. The words came through Myra's earpiece in Kethvari primary register, a language built around long vowel harmonics and precise tonal shifts that the Kethvari produced through a secondary throat structure humans didn't have. The translation software in her earpiece rendered it in English in real time, but the rendering was mechanical, flat, stripped of the harmonic layers that gave Kethvari speech its full meaning. Myra caught several nuances the software had missed entirely. She caught, specifically, that Vrix Ethan had not called her a translator. She had called her a voice rendering unit. In Kethvari linguistic structure, unit designated a tool, a piece of equipment, the kind of word you used for a processor or a filtering membrane, not a person. Davin Cho, who did not speak Kethvari, heard only, "You are the new voice rendering unit." He looked at Myra with the careful blankness of someone who had learned to wait and see. Myra set her bag down beside the chair that had been configured for a human occupant. She took a breath. She pulled out her thermos and set it on the table. "I'm Myra Vasquez," she said in Kethvari primary register. She shaped the harmonics carefully, hitting the respect register tones for an initial introduction without tilting into the subordinate register that the word unit had implied she should occupy. "Senior Interpreter, Translation Division, New Geneva Annex. I'll be providing real-time linguistic support for today's session." Vrix Ethan's lateral sensory organs moved. A small adjustment, barely perceptible, but Myra had read the behavioral appendix twice and she recognized it. The Consul General was recalibrating. She had expected Myra to respond in English, routed through software, the way every previous interpreter had. She had not expected to be addressed in her own language, in a register that was grammatically correct and tonally appropriate and notably not apologetic. She looked at Myra for a long moment. Then she said in Kethvari, "Your secondary harmonics are passable." Which, in Kethvari primary register, coming from a consul general to someone she'd just met, was not quite a compliment. But it wasn't a dismissal either. It was the linguistic equivalent of "I'm paying attention now." Davin caught Myra's eye from across the table. His expression was professionally neutral, but she could see, in the small compression at the corner of his mouth, that he had understood something had just happened, even without knowing what. The session was a pre-briefing for a larger Senate hearing scheduled 4 days out. The hearing was about trade access along the Meridian Corridor, a stretch of 11 transit routes through contested deep space that touched the interests of 6 member species and 1 non-member entity that was technically a corporate collective, but had been operating like a sovereign state for decades long enough that nobody used the corporate collective language anymore except in legal filings. Kethvar had significant interests in the corridor. Their deep space infrastructure sat at 2 of the 11 route nodes, which meant any traffic regulation negotiated without their input would effectively function as a tax on every ship they moved through their own claimed territory. They were, understandably, in a mood about it. Vrix Ethan spent the first 20 minutes of the session providing what the agenda called contextual background, and what was, in practice, a meticulous recounting of every point at which Kethvar's interests had been underweighted, ignored, or actively discounted in the 7 years of preliminary corridor negotiations. She was not angry about it, not in any way that read as anger in the human emotional vocabulary. She was, in the Kethvari emotional register, something closer to architecturally correct. She was laying out a structure. She was building the case the way an engineer builds a support column, precisely without sentiment, because the precision was the point. Myra translated in real time, her voice low and steady, rendering each statement into English for Davin and the 2 other human aides who had filed in quietly at the 20-minute mark. She caught 4 tonal shifts that the software would have missed, 3 that indicated specific degrees of certainty about different claims, and 1 that indicated that Vrix Ethan was being deliberately understated about the economic projections, not because she was hiding anything, but because understatement in Kethvari primary register was a form of emphasis. This number is so obviously significant that I don't need to perform urgency about it. She translated that nuance as a brief parenthetical after the figure, and she's indicating this is being stated conservatively. One of the aides glanced at her. Myra kept her eyes on Vrix Ethan. At the 40-minute mark, the Consul General paused and looked at Myra directly. "Voice rendering unit," she said. "Interpreter," Myra said back, in Kethvari, in a register that was calm and completely undefensive, the linguistic equivalent of "I'm correcting you" without making a fight of it. Another adjustment of the lateral sensory organs. A very brief shift in the blue-gray of her skin, barely a shimmer, something Myra had to know to look for. In Kethvari chromatic response vocabulary, it was a marker of what translated closest to reassessment. "Interpreter," Vrix Ethan repeated. And then she continued her briefing. Davin later, when they were alone in the corridor outside while Vrix Ethan was in a separate room taking a call from her home administration, said, "What was that?" "What was what?" "The thing at the 40-minute mark. She said something and then she changed what she said." "She used an incorrect title," Myra said. "I corrected her." Davin looked at her for a moment. "You corrected a consul general." "She used an incorrect title," Myra said again. "I work in translation. Titles are my job." Davin was quiet for a moment. Then, the last 2 interpreters who worked with her both filed reassignment requests within a week. "I know," Myra said. She opened her thermos and took a long drink of coffee. "I'm not going to do that." "Why not?" Myra considered that. "Because she's actually interesting," she said. "She's the most strategically sophisticated negotiator I've translated for in 3 years. She's also been poorly served by mechanical software that can't catch about 40% of what she's actually saying, which means she's been sitting in rooms full of humans for 14 months, and nobody has understood her properly. She paused. "That would make me difficult to work with, too," she said. Davin looked at her for a long time. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Myra said. "Go check on the session schedule. I think we're running 20 minutes long, and she's going to have opinions about that." Part 2, the file. 3 days before the Senate hearing, something landed on Myra's desk that had not been on her assignment queue. She noticed it the way you notice something that's wrong about a familiar picture. Not immediately, not in the first glance, but in the second one when the visual pattern doesn't match what you expected. She was opening her session prep files for the morning when she saw it sitting there in the queue alongside everything else, tagged with a classification marker she'd never seen in a translation assignment before. Document Deathworld Ecological Assessment, Earth, Sol III, Galactic Survey Corps Report, Survey Cycle 71. Classification, GSC Restricted. Requested for Senate floor translation support by Office of the Secretary General. She opened it. She read for 11 minutes without touching her coffee. Then she closed it, sat very still for a moment, and opened it again. The Galactic Survey Corps, a joint scientific body funded by the Senate and staffed by researchers from 17 member species, had been producing Deathworld assessments for 90 years. The program had started as a practical exercise. Before a new species was invited into the galactic community, the GSC conducted a thorough ecological and biological survey of their home world to determine, among other things, what risks they posed and what risks they faced. The assessments looked at gravity, atmospheric composition, solar radiation, magnetic field strength, biodiversity, apex predator pressure, pathogen environments, and 100 other variables. The assessments were then assigned a Deathworld classification on a scale from 1 to 12. A Class 1 world was essentially inert. Low biodiversity, stable climate, few or no apex predators, minimal pathogen pressure. The kind of world where life had emerged cautiously and quietly and stayed that way. The Kethvar homeworld was a Class 2. The Thurani Collective's homeworld was a Class 3. Class 12 was, and this was not metaphor, the scale's way of saying this world is actively trying to kill everything that lives on it, and the things that live on it have adapted to survive anyway. No surveyed world had ever achieved a Class 12 designation. The highest previous designation had been Class 9, assigned to a world in the Verath system whose dominant megafauna included a land-based organism that massed approximately 4,000 kilograms, operated in coordinated group behavior, and had developed, through evolutionary pressure, an immune system complex enough that it could adapt to novel pathogens in real time. Earth had been surveyed on record 4 times. Survey Cycle 12, the first contact survey conducted before the Accord. Classification assigned Class 4. Survey Cycle 28, a routine resurvey 15 years after the Accord. Classification assigned Class 4. Survey Cycle 47, a resurvey prompted by the Colony Expansion Act, which required updated home world assessments for any species seeking expanded galactic territory rights. Classification assigned, Class 5. There had been a notation in the report Myra now saw, reading back through the archived surveys, that had been flagged by the lead surveyor. Classification adjusted upward after review committee noted significant variance in preliminary assessments. Surveyor discretion applied. Recommend re-examination of assessment methodology for atmospheric pathogen index. Survey Cycle 71, the current report. Prompted by, and here was the part that made Myra set her coffee down, a formal request from 3 member species, 2 of which were major corridor negotiation partners, asking for a formal reassessment of Earth's Deathworld classification in light of newly available biological data and a review of historical assessment discrepancies. The report was 340 pages. Myra read all of it. It took her 4 hours and 20 minutes, and when she finished, she sat at her desk for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the specific quality of stillness that comes when you've understood something that is going to change the shape of a room. The new classification was a Class 8. Not because anything about Earth had changed. Because the previous surveys had been wrong. Not maliciously wrong. Not fraudulently wrong. just wrong in the way that happens when a survey team from a Class 2 or Class 3 world tries to assess a Class 8 world using their own biological intuitions as a reference point. They had looked at Earth and they had seen too much. Too much biodiversity, too much predator pressure, too many pathogens, too many environmental variables. They had registered it all as complicated, and they had translated complicated into their classification rubric, using the experiential understanding of beings who had evolved in much quieter places. They had not understood at a gut level what they were actually looking at. The Survey Cycle 71 team had included, for the first time, a comparative evolutionary biologist from a species called the Sarathi, who had done her doctoral research specifically on how assessment methodology bias affected Deathworld classifications for complex biosphere worlds. She had gone back through the raw data from all 4 Earth surveys. She had reprocessed it through a standardized framework that the GSC had developed in 2198, but that had never been retroactively applied to earlier assessments. And the numbers had come back very different. Earth's gravity was 9.8 meters per second squared. The galactic average for inhabited worlds was 6.2. Humans had evolved under a gravitational load that would cause significant cardiovascular stress in the majority of member species after prolonged exposure, and had not only adapted to it, but developed skeletal and muscular density that was, by galactic standards, extreme. Earth's pathogen environment was, the report used the word relentless, not dramatic, not embellished, just relentless. The quantity and variety and adaptive speed of Earth's microbial life had no parallel in the surveyed member species' homeworlds. Humans had evolved an immune response system of corresponding complexity. The report noted, in neutral scientific language, that a human immune system, if you could extract it and run it as a standalone analysis, would be classified by GSC methodology as a hostile biological defense network, the same category used to classify active pathogen weapons. Earth's apex predator history, which was relevant to Deathworld classification, because the pressures of surviving apex predation drove evolutionary development in specific ways, had included, within the last 100,000 years, organisms that the report listed carefully. Megafauna of multiple tons, pack predators with coordinated hunting strategies, water-dwelling organisms that the report noted, represent some of the most efficient biological weapons delivery systems in the surveyed catalog. Humans had competed with all of them, and then humans had won. The report did not editorialize. It did not make claims about what this meant for galactic relations or Senate policy or anything beyond the biological facts. It was a scientific survey document. It was exactly what it said it was. But the biological facts, laid out in order, had a cumulative weight. The section that Myra came back to twice was the section on biological adaptation response. The GSC survey team had wanted to understand not just what Earth was, but what surviving it had made humans. They had looked at bone density, muscle fiber type ratios, cardiovascular architecture, neurological pain processing, hormonal stress response, immune complexity, caloric efficiency, thermal regulation, and about 60 other variables. The section was titled, in the flat language of scientific reports, Comparative Assessment, Biological Resilience Metrics Homo sapiens. The summary paragraph read, in part, across all assessed resilience metrics, Homo sapiens demonstrate outlier characteristics that are individually notable and collectively unprecedented in the surveyed member species catalog. The cumulative effect of evolving in a Class 8 environment, under elevated gravitational load, continuous pathogen pressure, multi-apex competitive pressure, and severe climatic variability, has produced a species whose baseline biological parameters place them at or above the maximum of the galactic distribution curve in multiple survival-critical categories. It then listed those categories. There were 17 of them. Myra had grown up on Earth. She'd skinned her knees on concrete. She'd had flu twice and strep throat once, and a broken arm at age 11 from falling out of a tree. She'd gone hiking in the Cascades and been caught in a hailstorm and been fine, and she'd thought nothing of it. She was reading this report and understanding, with a peculiar and growing quiet feeling, that she had never thought about herself the way this report was describing her. She had never thought about what it meant to be from a Class 8 world. The file was assigned to her for Senate floor translation, because the session was going to include Vrix Ethan, whose Kethvari primary register needed a real translator rather than the automated system. And because Vrix Ethan's office had specifically, and this was in the assignment notes, requested that the interpreter from the pre-briefing session be present for the full hearing. Myra read that note twice. Then she went to find Davin. She requested me specifically, she said. I know, Davin said. She called me a voice rendering unit 2 days ago. I know, Davin said, and then she called you an interpreter, and then she filed a session quality note with her office that our liaison flagged this morning, which is why you got the assignment. He paused. I don't read Kethvari, obviously, but the rough translation we got said something about first adequate linguistic support received in New Geneva facility, which is apparently high praise. Myra looked at him. Huh, she said. Yeah, Davin said. So, the Deathworld file, have you read it? All of it. And I need 2 things, Myra said. I need the original GSC survey documents in their raw data format, not the Senate formatted summary. And I need 30 minutes with whoever drafted the presentation materials, because there are 3 places in the current translation draft where the tonal weighting is going to land completely wrong in Kethvari register. And one of them is in the opening statement, which is the worst possible place for a mistranslation. Davin stared at her. The hearing is in 3 days, he said. I know, Myra said, so we should start now. She spent the next 3 days essentially living at her desk. She went home twice to sleep, properly sleep, not the doze over a datapad thing that she'd done as a student, and had sworn off in her mid-20s after a memorable incident involving a mistranslated trade agreement and a 3-hour emergency session at 4 in the morning. She went home, slept for 5 hours, came back. She ate at her desk. She drank an amount of coffee that Devlin, who made the pot too strong, started eyeing with the careful concern of someone watching a structural situation develop. The challenge was not the translation itself. The translation was hard, but it was her kind of hard, the kind where the problem was real and solvable, and the solution required genuine knowledge rather than guesswork. The challenge was the layering. The Senate hearing was going to have simultaneous translation feeds for 9 different species in the chamber. Most of those could run through the automated systems without significant loss. But Kethvari and 3 other member languages had tonal or harmonic components that the automated systems flattened into something that was technically accurate and experientially wrong. Like showing someone a photograph of a piece of music. All the notes were correct, but it wasn't music. She had to translate the Deathworld report not just into Kethvari linguistic structure, but into Kethvari conceptual structure, which meant understanding how a Kethvari would process the information. What would register as significant? What would register as surprising? What the cultural and biological reference points were that would make the numbers land with appropriate weight. This was where it got interesting. The Kethvari homeworld was a Class 2. Stable, quiet, low pressure. The Kethvari had evolved in an environment where the primary evolutionary pressures were social and organizational. Their remarkable intelligence and their sophisticated hierarchical culture were the product of thousands of years of intraspecies competition in a relatively benign physical environment. They were biologically, physically moderate, not fragile by any means, but accustomed to thinking of their cognitive architecture as their defining evolutionary advantage. The Deathworld report was going to tell them, and the assembled Senate, that humanity's bodies were, by every measurable biological standard, extraordinary. Myra needed to find the language that would make that land without sounding like bragging, without sounding like threat, and without triggering the specific Kethvari status response that activated when they perceived a challenge to their hierarchical self-conception. It was, she thought at 2 in the morning on day 2, an extremely delicate piece of work. She was also, she realized, sitting very straight at her desk, completely awake, with the specific electric focus of someone who is doing exactly the thing they were built to do. Part 3, the chamber. The main Senate floor in the New Geneva Annex held 240 seats, configured in a wide arc around a central presentation area that the building's designers had called the Well, and that everyone who worked here called the Pit. It was not a hostile name, it was just accurate. The pit sat lower than the surrounding seats by about 3 meters, accessible by 4 ramps that converged from different angles. The speaker or presenter stood in the pit. The assembled delegates sat in the arc above, looking down. The design was intended to be inclusive, all perspectives equidistant from the central point. But it had, over 54 years, developed the feeling of a natural arena. Myra had been in the chamber maybe a dozen times. She was usually positioned in the Translator's gallery, a long, narrow space along the chamber's east wall at mid-height, behind a continuous panel of sound-dampening glass that let her see everything and be heard through the speaker feed without being visible as a presence in the room. The gallery had 6 stations, each equipped with a direct feed monitor, a translation console, and a seat that had been ergonomically adjusted for human occupants by someone who had clearly never consulted a human being in the process. The chair was too low, the console was too high. There was a footrest that was too far forward to actually be useful. She had solved this, over several sessions, with a combination of a cushion she brought from home and the specific adaptation of just accepting mild discomfort as a professional constant. She was at her station 40 minutes before the session was scheduled to open. The chamber was already filling. The species mix in the gallery was, she did a quick visual census from habit, heavier than usual, 12 Kethvari in the upper right block, which was more than she typically saw at corridor negotiations. A full delegation of Theorani in their enclosure. The Theorani required specific atmospheric conditions and used a modified section with regulated air. The Sarathi block, which usually ran small, was at full delegation strength, which was notable because the lead GSC surveyor on the Deathworld report was Sarathi. 8 Veth representatives, 4 of whom were from the Deep Space Merchant Consortium that had direct interests in the corridor. A scattering of human delegates from colonial and home-world administrations, plus the Secretary General's office staff in their usual positions in the center left. Standing in the corridor outside the Kethvari block, not seated, because the Kethvari support frame arrangement meant they positioned their senior members differently than seated species, was Vrix Ethon. Myra couldn't see her face from this angle and distance, but she could see the status drape. The Consul General had changed it for the formal session. This one was deeper blue, with silver threading in patterns that, Myra had learned from her reading, indicated active negotiation status, combined with home administration authorization to speak for Kethvar's full sovereign position. It was the diplomatic equivalent of walking in with a full mandate. She was not here for a preliminary conversation. She was here to do something. Myra adjusted her feed settings, ran a quick check on the translation system, verified the Kethvari language module was loaded at full sensitivity rather than the default reduced mode that the automated system used. She pulled up the Deathworld report in her monitor's secondary window. She took a drink from her thermos. Davin had managed to get her a seat in the Translator's gallery rather than the floor, which she'd requested specifically. From the gallery, she could watch faces. She could watch the chamber. She could see what was happening not just in the words, but in the room. The pit was still empty. The automated voice, a gender-neutral tone that had been calibrated after extensive research into what kind of voice felt neutral to the largest number of member species, a process that had taken 4 years and produced something that sounded vaguely like a singing bowl played at very low volume, announced that the session would begin in 10 minutes. The session opened with the standard procedural elements that Myra had translated so many times they existed in her brain as a kind of warm-up exercise, like scales before a performance. Credentials established, quorum confirmed, the agenda read into record by the session clerk in 3 official languages with automated feeds running the other 6. The first item was the Corridor Negotiation Framework Update, presented by a human delegate from the Colonial Trade Ministry named Vasanthan, who was methodical and spoke at a pace that was kind to the translation systems. Myra rendered his Kethvari feed with the additional harmonic layers, catching his stress patterns and translating them accurately rather than literally. When he said, "Significant progress has been made," the technical translation would have lost the specific qualifier he was reaching for, which was closer to progress that doesn't yet match the problem's scale. She translated it as, "Movement has occurred, though the Consul General and others will reasonably assess it as proportionally insufficient to the remaining complexity." She caught Vrix Ethan's lateral sensory organs, adjust slightly from her position in the gallery. Good. The second item was a presentation from the Veth Merchant Consortium representative, delivered through a fully automated system, because the lead Veth delegate was actually more comfortable with machine translation than live interpretation. The Veth, unusually among galactic species, trusted algorithmic precision over organic rendering. Myra let that run and focused on reading the room. The third item was, and this was where things became something else entirely, the GSC report. The session clerk introduced it in the flat language of procedural announcement. Item 3. Galactic Survey Corps Assessment, Survey Cycle 71, Subject World, Earth, Sol III. Presented by GSC Liaison to the Senate, Dr. Vera Ingram. Dr. Ingram was 53 and had the bearing of someone who had spent her career translating scientific complexity into policy language, and had made peace with the fact that this was the hardest possible job. She stood in the pit with a presentation tablet and did not look particularly nervous, which impressed Myra, because Myra knew what was in the document Dr. Ingram was about to present, and she would have been at least somewhat nervous. "Thank you," Dr. Ingram said. "I'll be brief on procedural context and then move directly to findings." The GSC's mandate for this assessment came from a formal request filed jointly by 3 member species on the basis of historical methodology concerns with previous Earth surveys. We conducted a full reassessment using updated standardized methodology. I want to be clear about something before I present the findings. The methodology used here is the same methodology that has been applied to all member world surveys for the last 43 years. We applied it to Earth because it had not previously been applied. These are not new facts about Earth. They are existing facts, accurately measured. She paused. The Earth Deathworld classification has been revised from Class 5 to Class 8. She said it the way you say something you've been rehearsing. Clearly, without drama, with the specific neutrality of someone who knows the statement doesn't need embellishment. The chamber did not erupt. It didn't make any loud noise at all. But Myra had been watching chambers for 3 years, and she knew the sound of a room changing temperature, and that's what she heard. A kind of collective intake, not audible, just atmospheric. A room recalibrating. She was watching Vrix Ethan. The Consul General went still. Not frozen, not shocked exactly. The specific quality of stillness that Myra had come to associate in her Kethvari behavioral study with significant new data entering a well-established framework. Dr. Ingram walked through the findings section by section, and Myra translated in real time, her voice in the Kethvari channel low and precise, hitting every harmonic marker, every tonal weight. She had prepared for this. She had spent 3 nights preparing for this. When Dr. Ingram reached the gravitational load section, Myra translated it not with the dry metric comparison, but with the specific reference point she'd identified as the most comprehensible for Kethvari cognitive processing. She framed it as a structural load comparison, because the Kethvari had extensive engineering culture and understood structural load instinctively. Imagine the load your most advanced compression structure bears at maximum rated capacity. Humans carry a comparable load in their bones, continuously, as a baseline biological condition. She caught something in Vrix Ethan's posture, a minute adjustment. When Dr. Ingram reached the pathogen environment section, Myra translated it with the specific Kethvari framing for biological complexity. The Kethvari classified biological systems, the way engineers classified mechanical systems, in terms of redundancy and fail-safe architecture. Earth's microbial environment operates at a complexity level that would be classified, in Kethvari engineering taxonomy, as a multi-node redundant adversarial network. Human immune architecture is its corresponding defense structure, equally complex, equally adversarial, and shaped by the same evolutionary pressure. Vrix Ethan's lateral sensory organs were fully extended. When Dr. Ingram reached the apex predator history section and began describing, in measured scientific language, the catalog of organisms that humanity had competed with and outlasted, Myra translated with a different register than she'd used for anything else in the session. She dropped into the Kethvari register that was used for historical accounts. A formal register, slower paced, with specific tonal markers that signaled this is a lineage account. This is the record of what a people survived. Because that's what it was. The Kethvari understood lineage accounts. Their own culture was built on them. The record of what your people had survived was the foundation of what your people were. She was translating the story of what humans had survived, and she was translating it in the language structure that would make a Kethvari understand, in their bones, what that survival meant. The chamber was very quiet. Dr. Ingram reached the final section, the biological resilience metrics, the 17 categories. She read them in order. Myra translated each one, hitting the register, shaping the harmonics, not embellishing, not dramatizing, just rendering the facts in the language that would let them land with their full weight. Skeletal density, outlier, maximum of galactic distribution. Muscle fiber resilience, outlier. Cardiovascular recovery rate, outlier. Neurological pain processing threshold, outlier. Immune system complexity, outlier. Thermal regulation range, outlier. Caloric efficiency under stress, outlier. On and on. 17 times. Outlier, outlier, outlier. The facts, just the facts. Dry language, precise measurements, the flat voice of a scientific report. And then Dr. Ingram closed her tablet and said, "The GSC's conclusion is that Earth represents the highest complexity Class 8 environment in the current surveyed catalog, and that Homo sapiens are the first species in the survey record to have evolved in such an environment and achieved sapience. These are the findings. We make no policy recommendations from this data. We simply provide the record." She stepped back from the pit. The chamber was silent. Myra had been watching Vrix Ethon for the last 20 minutes, not continuously. She couldn't stare. She had a job. But in the quick assessments she could make between translation passes. She'd been watching because the Consul General was the person in this room whose response she was most equipped to read. Vrix Ethon was not still anymore. She was not performing anything. She was not displaying any strong chromatic response. But her posture had changed in the specific way that Myra had come to associate, from the behavioral appendix, with deep structural reconsideration. The Kethvari equivalent of having a foundational assumption quietly removed and finding, with some surprise, that the structure hasn't fallen down, just reconfigured into something different. The lateral sensory organs were fully extended and oriented. Myra realized, not toward the pit where Dr. Ingram had been standing. They were oriented toward the translator's gallery. Toward Myra. The Secretary General opened the floor for questions. The procedural formality of it felt slightly unreal given the atmosphere in the chamber, but it was the right move, give the room something structured to do while it processed. The first 3 questions were technical, about the methodology, about the historical survey data, about the timeline of the reassessment. Dr. Ingram answered them with the specific precision of someone who had expected them. The 4th question came from the Kethvari block. Not from Vrix Ethon. From a lower-ranking delegate in the block, Myra recognized the status drape indicators, whose name she didn't know. The question, rendered through the automated Kethvari feed in its usual flattened tone, came through as something like, "What are the implications for Kethvar's position in corridor negotiations, given that human colonial administration claims operate from this revised biological context?" Dr. Ingram said, carefully, that implications for specific negotiations were outside the GSC's mandate. And then Vrix Ethon spoke. She had not spoken previously in the session. She was registered on the agenda as an observer, not a presenter. Her formal statements were scheduled for a later session. But the floor was open, and she was a Consul General with full mandate authorization, and the session clerk, who knew the rules, recognized her. She spoke in Kethvari primary register, in the full formal address structure, with all the harmonic complexity that the automated system would flatten into approximately 40% of its actual meaning. Myra was already translating before Vrix Ethon had finished her first sentence. "I wish to address the record," the Consul General said. "I have served at this annex for 14 months. In that time, I have participated in 47 formal sessions and 19 preliminary briefings. I have consistently noted that the linguistic rendering available for Kethvari participation has been insufficient to convey the full dimension of Kethvari position and reasoning. I have made formal note of this 7 times. Myra translated. Her voice was steady and clear in the English feed and the other language feeds that ran off her relay. Today, Vrix Ethan continued, I received adequate translation for the first time. What I heard today and what I was able to understand today fully in my own conceptual framework is the following. A pause, a Kethvari pause, which had a specific tonal signature that meant, I am about to say something that I have weighed. The species we have been negotiating with for 7 years regarding transit rights through their colonial territory, a negotiation in which we have consistently characterized their position as overreaching, their claims as disproportionate, their resistance as obstinacy, evolved on a Class 8 world. Another pause. We evolved on a Class 2 world, and we have been negotiating with them as though our experience of survival were the baseline from which their experience deviated. The chamber was still. It was not their deviation, Vrix Ethan said. It was ours. Myra translated the last sentence, and then stopped speaking and let the silence sit. It was the right thing to do. She'd learned early in her career that some translated statements needed a moment of empty air after them. Not for drama, for absorption. Part 4 after. The session formally adjourned an hour later, after a procedural series of follow-up questions and one extended statement from the Thurani delegation that Myra translated on autopilot, her attention still partly caught in the quality of what had just happened. She packed up her station while the chamber emptied. She coiled her headset lead. She put her thermos in her bag. She was doing the same things she always did at the end of a session, the small, familiar inventory of wrapping up, and she was doing them with the specific physical awareness of someone who has just been through something that doesn't quite have a name yet. She came down from the translator's gallery into the main corridor and nearly walked into Davin, who was waiting with the look of someone who had been waiting for a specific reason. The Consul General wants to speak with you, he said. I know, Myra said. How do you know? Because I watched her face for 3 hours, Myra said. Where? They met in one of the small conference rooms off the North Corridor. These rooms had been designed for informal follow-up conversations after sessions, smaller than the deliberation halls, with furniture that could be rearranged, natural light through a single large window, no formal presentation set up, just a space for people to talk. Vrix Ethan was already there, her support frame positioned by the window. 2 members of her delegation staff were in the corridor outside. She had dismissed them from the room. Myra came in alone, because that's what she understood was being asked for. The Consul General looked at her. Her lateral sensory organs were at rest, not fully retracted but not extended in the heightened attention position they'd been in during the session. Her chromatic display was a warmer shade of blue-gray than Myra had seen before. In the Kethvari behavioral vocabulary, warmer was closer to what you might call settled, or considered, post-processing of significant information. Interpreter, Vrix Ethan said. Consul General, Myra said. The translation you provided today, Vrix Ethan said, in Kethvari primary register, was not machine translation. No, Myra said. The framing you used for the gravitational load data, that was not in the source document. It wasn't, Myra said. The source document used a metric comparison that doesn't have a natural conceptual anchor in Kethvari experiential vocabulary. I substituted a structural load comparison because the Kethvari engineering tradition gives you an immediate intuitive reference for what that kind of pressure means over time. The data was accurate. The framing was an interpretive choice. Vrix Ethan was quiet for a moment. The lineage account register, she said, for the apex predator history. Yes, that was deliberate. It was. Another pause, longer this time. Why, the Consul General asked. Myra thought about how to answer this. The honest answer was also the complete answer, so she used the honest one. Because it was the accurate register, she said. The document is a record of what a people survived. That's what a lineage account is. I could have translated it in the standard scientific assessment register, which would have conveyed the data accurately. But it would have lost the register that was already implicit in the material. I didn't add a register. I recognized the one that was there. Vrix Ethan's lateral sensory organs moved. A slow, deliberate extension. Myra had studied enough Kethvari behavioral reference material to know that this was a different movement than the quick recalibration adjustments she'd seen in the session. This one was the closest term the behavioral appendix offered was acknowledgement offered deliberately, not reactive, chosen. "I called you a voice rendering unit," the Consul General said. "You did," Myra said. "You corrected me." "I did." "Why didn't you simply accept the designation? The previous interpreters in this facility did not correct me." Myra thought about that. "Because I knew what I was," she said. "And I knew the word you were using was wrong, not offensive necessarily, just wrong. A voice rendering unit renders sounds. I translate meaning. Those are different jobs. It mattered that you understand the difference. Because if you thought you were getting a voice rendering unit, you would have calibrated your communication accordingly, and you would have gotten less than what was possible." Vrix Ethan was quiet. "You were protecting the quality of the translation," she said. "I was," Myra said, "by insisting on accurate terminology for your own function." "Yes." A long moment. The natural light through the window was the late afternoon quality that made the conference room feel warmer than the technical temperature could account for. "The assessment," Vrix Ethan said. "The Deathworld file, what the report describes about your species." She paused. Myra waited. "You knew the content of the report before the session," the Consul General said. "It wasn't a question." "I did. I was responsible for preparing the translation materials." "How long ago did you know?" 3 days. Vrix Ethan's chromatic display shifted slightly. The warmer shade deepened, and Myra's reference memory identified it as close to, and she had to be careful here because the behavioral vocabulary was inexact in cross-cultural translation, something like the recognition of a quality you had not anticipated. "You spent 3 days with that information," the Consul General said. "The knowledge that your species is classified at a level that exceeds the experience of every member world in the Senate, including mine. You spent 3 days with it and you came into this chamber and your work was you did not dramatize it. You did not perform. You rendered it accurately." "That's the job," Myra said. "It is not only the job," Vrix Ethan said. "It requires a specific quality, the capacity to hold significant information about yourself and set it aside in service of the accurate transmission of the information itself." Another pause. "My species calls that quality something that translates roughly as structural integrity. It is considered one of the highest functional virtues in Kethvari professional vocabulary." She looked at Myra. "You demonstrated it," she said. Myra didn't say anything for a moment. She was aware of the specific quality of being seen accurately by someone who had looked at you correctly. It was different from compliment, different from praise. It was closer to the feeling of a measurement taken properly. "Thank you," she said finally, in Kethvari primary register, with a harmonic layer that indicated genuine receipt of significant communication rather than social acknowledgement. Vrix Ethan's lateral sensory organs adjusted once more. "I intend to file a formal request with this annex," she said, "for dedicated professional linguistic support at all future sessions involving Kethvari participation, with a specific designation for an interpreter rather than a machine system." A pause. "And I intend to specify that the designated interpreter should be someone capable of recognizing existing registers, rather than imposing standardized ones." She did not say Myra's name. She didn't need to. "That seems reasonable," Myra said. "I also intend," Vrix Ethan said, "to formally withdraw the claim that human colonial corridor interests are overreaching." The room was quiet. The claim was based on an assessment framework that did not account for the actual nature of the world those interests emerge from, the Consul General said. "That is not overreach. That is proportion. We were calling it overreach because we were measuring it against what we would claim from our own world with our own history." She paused. "It is a significant recalibration." "Yes," Myra said. "It will affect the negotiations considerably." "I expect so." A long moment between them. The light through the window was going amber. "The report stated 17 outlier categories," Vrix Ethan said. "It did." "Across all categories, humans were at or above the maximum of the galactic distribution." "Yes." The consul general was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a tone that was, and Myra had to reach for the closest translation, it wasn't quite any single word. The kind of honest bewilderment that comes when a genuinely intelligent person encounters something that has simply never been in their frame before. "And you sent a translator?" Myra felt something shift in her chest. Not pride exactly, something older and quieter than pride. The feeling of your full context being visible and recognized by someone who could actually read it. "We sent a translator," she said, "because you needed one." She walked out of the conference room into the corridor, and the corridor was the corridor it had always been. The terracite floors, the scuff marks from the Creth mobility frames, the overhead panels tuned for a mix of species that nobody had fully standardized because full standardization was, it turned out, not really the goal. Davin was sitting in a chair by the wall outside, datapad in his lap, not looking at it. He stood when she came out. "Well," he said, "she's withdrawing the overreach claim," Myra said, "and she's filing a formal request for dedicated interpreter support. Probably some policy changes will come out of the session once people have had time to process the report." Davin was quiet for a moment. "Because of the translation," he said. "Because of the facts in the report," Myra said. "The translation just meant she could actually receive the facts." He nodded slowly. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was a question nobody in a professional setting asked often enough, Myra thought. It was the right question, though. She considered it. "Tired," she said. "Good tired, the kind you get when you did the thing right." He nodded again. They walked down the corridor toward the translation office, and the building around them was the building it had always been. The ambitious, exhausted, continuously trying architecture of a place that had been built for the best possible version of a complicated idea. The glass caught the late afternoon light and scattered it in ways the architects had planned. The gardens on the terraces were being tended by someone who had been doing it for 9 years and knew every plant. Myra pushed through the translation office door and poured herself the last of the coffee from the pot, which was cold and too strong, and sat at her desk and pulled up her cue for the next day. She had 3 assignments. She started reading. That night on the transit pod home, she sat by the window and watched the city pass in its evening colors and thought about the report. About the 17 categories. About what it meant to have evolved from something relentless, to have come from a world that never once let up, and to have arrived here at this unremarkable moment in a comfortable seat on a public transit pod, tired in the good way. She thought about Vrick's Ethon saying, "And you sent a translator." There was something in that she couldn't quite name. Not defensiveness and not pride, those were the obvious options, and they were both slightly wrong. Something that was closer to the feeling of a thing being correctly weighed, of a scale that you hadn't realized was tilted, finally settling level. She had read the Deathworld report. She had sat with the knowledge of what her species was, biologically, by the standards of a galactic assessment framework she'd never thought to apply to herself. She'd grown up eating sandwiches and taking the bus and getting rained on and stubbing her toe on the edge of the bed frame in the dark. She'd also, apparently, been carrying a structural load in her bones that would cause cardiovascular stress in most of the species she translated for. She'd been running an immune system complex enough to qualify as a hostile defense network by GSC classification. She'd been descended from beings who had looked up at the apex predators of a Class 8 world and decided to stay. She sipped her cold coffee from the thermos. The pod was mostly empty. The lights of the city spread out in the darkening. There was something, she thought, about being the thing you are without knowing quite what it is. About spending years being exactly yourself, carrying your thermos, correcting your title, reading the behavioral appendix twice, staying late for 3 days to get the register right, without framing any of it as extraordinary. And then having someone from a very different world look at the whole picture and say, "Oh." The transit pod slid into her stop, and she gathered her bag and stepped out into the evening, which was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet, and walked the 3 blocks home with her coat open because she had always run slightly warm and never minded the cold much. Behind her in the New Geneva Annex, the building's overnight systems were cycling on. The terracite floors were being cleaned by the quiet machines that did it every night, smoothing the day's marks from the stone. The translation office queue was updating with the next day's assignments. Somewhere in the diplomatic correspondence system, a formal request from the office of Consul General Vrix Ethan of the Sovereignty of Kethvar was working its way through processing channels, carrying its specifications. And in the Senate archive, the Deathworld file sat in the record, officially entered, exactly what it was. Not a threat, not a boast, just the facts. Just the careful, neutral, precise record of what a world was and what it had made of the creatures who survived it. The rain came about 20 minutes after she got home. She didn't notice it, she was already asleep.